some of you got to read, and you'll notice that they both come from very recent times. So they're both things that were said by people, yesterday, the day before. The first comes from Rio de Janeiro, and it was said in 2010. You and your book of depoliticized Brazilian youth. When that book came out, they cared for each other, for other people, and for their country. Now, they have abandoned the revolution. They only want to make money. Thanks to you. I was impressed by the magical powers assigned to me by this speaker. The other thing was said to me by someone I didn't know in downtown Manhattan, who came over to me, who looked like an ex-football player, and he said, "Are you Marshall Berman? 10 years ago I was in the hospital. Your book got me out." Wow. So, this book of mine, this was the American edition put out by Penguin, and I guess this was a cover in the 1980s. It's a 1920s Cubist cityscape. Over 3 decades, it's had more intense reverberations than anything I've ever done. Reverberations just around the corner, reverberations thousands of miles away. It has touched solitaries and explored solitude, but it's also tried to grasp the life experience of whole generations. It's amazed me to see total strangers respond to it with passion. I mean, this is what I dreamed of, but it still knocks me out that it actually happens. Sometimes it has helped them in ways that have thrilled me. Sometimes it's enraged them. For all these years, the book seems to have been there for people. It's been through plenty of history, and it's helped me become part of the history of places whose history I never knew. It's actually my second book. The first book was called The Politics of Authenticity, about Montesquieu and Rousseau. It was out of print for many years, but it's been reprinted very recently, and it's available again. During the 1970s, I wrote many critical articles for the New York Times Book Review, The Nation, The Partisan Review, and Dissent, a social democratic magazine, which I'm an editor of now. And I came to believe that my first book hadn't gotten across to the world because it had too narrow an expanse. The horizon of my next project needed to be larger. When I first conceived of All That Solid, I imagined it in a very broad way, a vision of modern life with global scope, a cosmopolitan perspective that could embrace not only my neighborhood but the whole world, and that could help empower men and women everywhere. That was all. The book appeared in 1982, published by Simon & Schuster. It got a couple of enthusiastic reviews, but it didn't seem to have much of an impact on anyone. The publisher placed it in an ominous category of being that was called indefinitely out of stock. And this was a limbo that nobody could penetrate. I couldn't even get copies of the book to use in my closet. It was only after a couple of years of nasty exchanges and threats of lawsuits that my agent, Georges Bouchard, cried the book loose. Now it was out of print, but at least I had the rights. Now there was still a chance the book might have a future, might make it into the world after all. Then in the mid-'80s, even as I felt ignored, in a way I now can see that young writers often feel ignored, across various oceans, my book was getting discovered. It appeared in a wide range of places: the UK, Italy, Sweden, Spain and Mexico, Brazil. The buzz in Latin America was especially striking to me. For years, Latin intellectuals had rejected the whole modern paradigm as an ideological weapon of the USA, or, as they said, of the North. But in All That Solid, many Latin Americans seemed to find a vision of the modern that they felt was about them. This led to my visit to Brazil in the summer of 1987. It was an uncanny time. In Andy Warhol's phrase, I was famous for 15 minutes. Not everybody loved me. I criticized Brazilia's design for its lack of public space. Then Oscar Niemeyer, the communist Le Corbusier disciple who had designed the Capitol, he's still alive, he's 104, 104 today. A one-page headline appeared in the national press that said, Niemeyer, Berman, idiot. But plenty of Brazilians told me I was saying something they were sure was true, but that they wouldn't dare to say themselves. In Sao Paulo, reporters, Brasilia was the first city I visited. Sao Paulo after that. Reporters met me on the plane in Sao Paulo. Everything I said seemed to evoke thunderous applause. It was acclaimed by people all over Brazil's social order, from mayors and state governors to shop stewards from the Metal Workers Union, which is Lula's union. Such brilliant people, I thought, Brazil would be so lucky if they ever got any power. And then, of course, in the 2000s, some of them really did get power. To uniform cooks and kitchen workers in my Sao Paulo hotel, a man in a kitchen uniform knocked on my door, said he loved my book, asked me if I would sign it, and said I had many readers in the kitchen, and would I come down? So I came down, I spoke for a few minutes, and I signed books that I could tell had been seriously read. To a jazz singer who stopped his set to point me out, to a potter that was standing and waiting for the bus in front of his shop, and he ran out and gave me a beautiful bowl, and he said, this is to say thank you. Once on a radio talk show, I asked why Brazilians like me so much. The moderator said, this is interesting, Latin America, so this is the late 80s, Latin America was used to Marxists who wore black suits like Jesuits and condemned everything. I was a Marxist who thought critically, but I wore colored and celebrated love and happiness. A man from the audience added something. He said, you give a great commercial for freedom of speech. For Brazilians, this was a time of hope. They were caught up in the process of becoming a modern and a democratic place. They were coming out of the shadows after years of dirty wars. I can see some of you are old enough to remember those wars. And I know the rest of you have heard about them. They could walk through the streets without fear of being killed. Friends and children had stopped disappearing. Free speech was coming back. Could I be helping people talk again? Once, after I explained the Russian Revolution, I was asked by somebody else in the audience if I could also explain my dream life. Did I have dreams in Brazil? How did they compare with my dreams in the USA? Later, on the plane back to New York, as we cleared the mountains, I saw the answer. My whole month in Brazil has been a dream. And part of that dream can be the shirt itself, which I got in here. I got this in Sao Paulo in a shopping center for about $4. And then, after I got it, I was giving a paper, so I went and read, talked about my book, and people asked where I got the shirt, and I said, just around the corner, we can go to the shopping center. So I and several people went, and the guy said, we don't have such a shirt, where did you get that idea? And I said, right here, and I had a mixed, a buyer's slip, whatever you call it. And he said, it wasn't that shirt. We've never had that shirt before. So go figure. Brazil was a thrill, but it also had a happy afterlife. The tumult over there helped convince American publishers that my book could have a future in the USA. American Penguin brought out a paperback in 1988. including a preface that features Brazil and Dostoevsky. Um, the American Penguin is that limited but steady sales over 3 decades. This is also true of the Verso edition in the UK. In the 1990s and the 2000s, through the modern magic of translation, the book reached into some very different places. Iran, Poland, China, back into Brazil where there was a new translation just a couple of years ago. Meanwhile, it was translated into Lisbon Portuguese, a completely different from the Brazilian, completely different language from the Brazilian, so they told me. Into Turkish, into French, into Korean, into Polish, into Chinese, into Lithuanian. Within the next few months, it'll appear in Hebrew. So it's been around for 30 years. You could see it as part of a global culture, or part of an argument that there is such a thing as global culture. So I always had hopes for something like this, but it's amazing to see old and deep fantasies come true. Here is a picture. You can't, I mean, you can sort of see this, but you can't. Right? It's from Argentina in 1996, and it's a bunch of people who were about in the age range of most of your parents. They were people who had been in exile during the Dirty Wars, who had taken their kids to England, to Canada, to Belgium, and who then had begun to come back. And their kids were writing them, can we come back, can we come back? And they were arguing among themselves whether it was time to tell the kids it was okay to come back. And these people had been through everything. They'd lost some of their dearest friends. And the fact that they found something in my book was really flattering. In the last, I guess, 20 years or so, since the American edition has come out, I get calls from schools who want me to come and speak to students. And in particular, schools of architecture and city planning and urbanism. And when I talk with urbanists, they most want to talk about Jane Jacobs and Robert Moses, who were the polar stars of my chapter in New York. And they're fascinated with the turbulent years when suddenly in New York and other American cities, men and women began to think and act like citizens. And an urban public came into being. And I was there for all this, and I love to tell the story. It still sounds fresh and vital. What stopped Robert Moses in his tracks was a great wave of collective learning. Americans came to see that their cities couldn't be taken for granted. They were mortal and vulnerable. They needed to be nurtured and cared for. And ordinary people had the capacity to grasp that idea and act it out. People in New York and other cities, people came to see the point of keeping other people's neighborhoods alive, even if they didn't like the people, even if they'd never go to those neighborhoods or share their life. The 60s featured millions of ordinary people who not only loved their cities, but thought like citizens. As that public developed, the Lebensraum for imperial bureaucrats like Robert Moses shrank fast. When he died in 1981, he had come to feel, like so many of his victims, like my family of the 1950s, displaced and desolate. How come it happened? Is there anything that could make it happen again? I don't know. You could say the answers are blowing in the wind. But just to raise the questions is an education for us all. Alongside my stories of progress and growth, there is one vivid story of modern collapse and desolation, the ruins of the South Bronx. This is summarized in the last chapter. In the 1970s, I walked through those ruins obsessively, and it was block after block. It was like, you've all seen pictures in the paper and newsreels of bomb sites, cities that have been bombed, where there's block after block of nothing, and where I could remember these blocks as being full of people and being crowded, and suddenly there was nothing. I walked through the ruins obsessively, as if trying to penetrate to some mystical core. My quest for a core of meaning is one of the forces that drives that book and gives it life. But later, as years went by, I came to feel it was too much for me, and I stayed away. I never thought it would change in my lifetime. I couldn't imagine how. But then it was 2005. I was riding the L to the Bronx Zoo with my son and his class. Let's see, he's in the 13th grade now. So, this was the 5th grade? 6th grade. We were riding the L to the Bronx Zoo. You know what the L is? When the subway becomes an outdoor train. With my son and his class, and we were passing directly through where I knew the wreckage was. See, the kids were too short. They didn't know that there was anything special that was there. But I knew. And also, the subway had put up barriers after some of the stops so you couldn't see the ruins. But if you were tall and you stood on your toes, you could see them. So I stood up, craned my neck, braced myself, and the ruins were gone. And in their place, as the trains rode north, I saw ordinary apartment houses, trucks unloading, kids on bikes, old people on folding chairs, the whole smear of everyday modern city life. I said to the teachers on the train with me, look, it looks like an ordinary city. And they said, well, isn't the Bronx an ordinary city? Then I noticed how young they were. When the Bronx was burning in the 1970s, these girls weren't even born. Now it looked like nothing special, and yet the fact that it could look that way was miraculous. So the South Bronx today is a great story, a fine instance of the resilience of modern cities and of modern men and women who have the capacity both to commit herbicide and to overcome it, to reduce their whole environment to ruins and to rebuild the ruins, to turn apocalyptic reality into ordinary, nice urban reality where any of us could feel at home. Sometimes this public spirit, this urban public spirit, comes from the top. One important person here is the mayor of New York in the 80s and early 90s, Edward Koch. No relation to the brothers of Romney fame. And he established a $5 billion housing fund to rebuild buildings that had been torn down. And most of that money went to the South Bronx, to Harlem, and to Bedford-Stuyvesant in Brooklyn. But the Bronx got most of it. And he did something really heroic. He used the government in exactly the way that it's supposed to be used. But after Koch left office, he moved so far to the right that he became extremely embarrassed by this. When people congratulated him for really being heroic and saving the Bronx, he didn't want to be associated with it. So in fact, he had saved it. Here's a Latin American. I'm sorry, did you not hear? Okay, is that better? Okay. And here's a Latin American instance of something like this, and it comes from the city of Curitiba in Brazil. Curitiba is where the accordion bus was invented, and it was invented by Isaiah Lerner, who was the mayor of the city and then became governor of the state. The way I know about this is fascinating. I was invited to Curitiba in 98, 99, I'm not sure, for a Habitat for Humanity conference. And Lerner got up, not knowing I was there, and described reading the book. said, when he read this, and he quoted some of it, and he said, never again, we must never do this again. And he then called up the Institute of Technology and said, how can we avoid doing this? And then they invented the accordion bus, put in very extensive bus lanes, and a really impressive public transit system. And it's fascinating. I mean, I just don't know enough. What I know about Latin America is very kind of ad hoc and incidental, but it's fascinating that cities that are similar yet have dealt with similar problems in very different ways. So Lerner gets a gold star for that. Okay, then I'll skip some things and say, but I've always been attacked for the book, and attacked, among other things, by leftists who think I'm not left enough. They would denounce the universality of my horizon and the very idea of universality. And they said, they appointed themselves as Olympian judges of values, and they said that I was imposing modern values. Yeah, they said I was imposing modern values on cultures that have different values. So somehow they had picked up the authority, that they had the authority to say what values every culture has. How they got that authority, who granted it to them, wasn't explained. Anyway, these cultures, geographically or religiously or ethnically defined, sometimes all cultures were portrayed as innocent, and I was a kind of cultural rapist who violated their innocence. Sometimes discussions of all that solid got weird. Critics took whatever features of modern life most disturbed them and spoke as if I had the magical power to have made those things happen. This is something like what happened in Rio in that epigraph. Rage against my book often went with a reification of the idea of tradition, as if all the cultural, religious, and political traditions in world history were alike, as if they were all uniformly benign, as if people simply are whatever tradition they grew up in. They are Orthodox Jews, they are Nordic farmers, they are Sicilian fishermen, they are devout communists. And if they come to think differently, or secede from this world, or fall in love with their own people, or get their own with ideas, it's only because outside agitators like me have messed their minds up. For years I worried, how can I please these people? It took me a while to get it. Forget it. It's all part of a culture war that's been going on since the Enlightenment, so about 300 years maybe. One of the weirdest facets of modern modernity is all the cultural energy that it's generated that's gotten poured into this dreadful but ultimately hopeless quest to get out of modernity. Dostoevsky's pamphlet, The Legend of the Grand Inquisitor, prophesies the power of this quest. It's a primary source of the romance of totalitarianism, fascist, Stalinist, fundamentalist, that has driven so much modern history. It would be dumb not to be sad about our time's overflow of violence. Still, when I wrote all that solid, I meant to enroll myself in these times. If some of that emotional violence gets aimed at me, I still have to say yes when they call the roll. In this book, I see modern bourgeois society as a mix full of contradictions, creative as well as monstrous. Such a vision, one recent critic says, marks me as, this is a French word from World War II, a collaborationist. This sounds a lot like what some of Marx's attackers on the left, Proudhon, Bakunin, and their dumb followers used to say about him. Are they playing that song again? If he could take it, I can. One great leap forward in the history of the worldwide left is the breakdown of Leninism, with its romance of the vanguard and its contempt for democracy, civil liberties, and the people. Well, you can find all of this at the beginning of Lenin's first book, What Is to Be Done. It's which sounds in many ways more like Plato's Republic than like anything by Marx. The fall of the Berlin Wall is one symbol of this change. But even before that, within the left, times were changing. Nelson Mandela, while he was still a prisoner at Robben Island, was convinced, so he said, by a fellow prisoner, Joe Slovo, a lifelong communist like himself, and a fellow leader of the ANC, convinced that a free South Africa would have to have a full separation of powers, a constitutional court that could overrule the legislature and the executive, and a Bill of Rights. So it's clear to them that the left is committed to human rights, and I'm glad I could pass the word on. One human right that seems to embarrass many academic and political writers who often leave it out, but that real people know is crucial to living a good life in the modern world, is the right to love. I've written about love, but not enough. I'll write about it more. Love is not just an accessory of meaning, it's central to what human life can mean. Ideas of love go back to ancient times, but for most of history it's been understood as a privilege, even though an often tragic one, available only to the privileged few. A prime meaning of modernity is that the horizon of love opens up to embrace everybody. In Goethe's Faust, my chapter 1, Gretchen, a girl who does housework and childcare in the kitchen, is transformed by love into a tragic mensch. In Mozart's opera, The Magic Flute, performed in the revolutionary year of 1791, the lovers of comic, the bird catcher Papageno, this is a giant man who dresses like a bird, and his beloved Papagena, who rejoice in their commonness. They threaten to steal the show. Once people have seen and heard them, and some of Mozart's loveliest music is theirs, talking about love as a human right will seem perfectly natural. And books on the opera that leave them out, which there are many, will sound very weird. But what social conditions will it take? Here are a few. Crowds of metropolitan density, where strangers can encounter each other and sometimes become loving couples. Sexual freedom, where lovers can not only feel joy, but learn intimacy and discover each other in depth. Freedom to marry across the lines of class and religion and ethnicity, to make love the basis of lives that will carry life on. Freedom to marry is a crucial issue. It suggests that Romeo and Juliet is our first modern play. Leonard Bernstein and Jerome Robbins' musical, The West Side Story, brings this tragedy home. Have any of you seen any version of The West Side Story? Could people raise their hands if they have? So a fair number of you. Or heard the music from it? Okay. It's pretty hot. Another variation of drawn from it, the movie Fiddler on the Roof, uses the same scenario. I've spent my working life in a school in a city that in the late 20th century filled up more and more with immigrants. Our college cafeteria is an amazing microcosm of the world. Yet many of the students in it have grown up in families and neighborhoods that are closed and exclusive, steeped in sexual and religious and ethnic taboos, walled off from the world. Love blooms where it will, but for couples, especially for women who get across the lines, the tragic potentialities are real. Do any of you remember, I'm sure somebody will, the stirring song by Tracy Chapman, Across the Lines? Could people raise their hands if they know that song? Okay. If you don't, type it in. Type it in tonight and listen to it. And get out your handkerchief. Still, sometimes Papagena and Papagena overcome. You can see them together on Saturdays, shopping in markets or malls, exhausted but radiant, with strollers and tears in colors never known to man. A great hero of love died not long ago, a black woman named Mildred Jeter Loving. She and her husband Robert married across the lines of the 1950s. There's an NPR documentary that you can get. Uh, those of you who know how to use who are fluent in email and ways I'm not. But it's a great doc. The Confederate state of Virginia did everything it could to destroy them. It focused its wrath particularly on her. But she pressed their case, and years later the Supreme Court, in a thrilling decision, and this is such a great name, Loving versus Virginia, 1967, destroyed all the barriers to marriage between blacks and whites. Some of these barriers are older than the USA itself. Virginia's Racial Integrity Act goes back to the 1630s, not even to slavery, but even before slavery, and to the earliest days of European settlement in the New World. Attorney General Bobby Kennedy and Chief Justice Earl Warren deserve great credit for making this case happen, but the real heroes were the Lovings themselves, Papagena and Papageno, confronting the dragons of a potentially free but still malevolent state. The Loving complex of ideas may soon in the USA become the constitutional basis for gay marriage, and if it happens, it'll be a great victory for the right to love. And Loving can remind us that even in the most advanced modern countries in the world, modern rights are something that men and women still have to fight for. Now, I spoke before about how my book came to affect people who came from places that I knew nothing about, and how thrilling this was. It happened a generation ago in Latin America, and now in the 2000s it's happened in the Middle East. Typically for our century, much of the change has happened on the internet, but some of it happened and is still happening face to face. Now I'm going to skip something. All that solid in the last decade took on more life in countries with only the most fragile liberal and democratic traditions. In places where all the parties are taken for granted the total passivity of the people, it's a thrill to see masses of people displaying themselves and engaging the bad guys. They have real bastards and creeps above them, and it's likely to take many more winters before anything that they or we can recognize as spring can come. But that gives us time to affirm our solidarity with them and to tell the world that the Arab Spring is not just for Arabs. The current round of protests and fights for human rights in the Middle East began in Iran. Early in the 2000s, I started getting email letters from Iranians. They introduced themselves. Some of them told me they hoped they could speak their real names, but not yet. Two others, apparently younger, seemed more direct. 2 or 3 of them were young women. They said all that solid was circulating in Farsi in a bootleg form, and they all had found it a source of inspiration. In the early 2000s, it came out as a book, an elegant, forbidden book. A couple of years ago, I got one in the mail. And, without being able to read it, you can see it. Some of my Iranian correspondents came from newspapers and magazines, all of them vulnerable. Others were from Iran's remarkable samizdat film industry. Do you know the word samizdat? Okay, it's a late Soviet word, and it means self-published. That is, not licensed, not approved, not legitimate. And some of the best Soviet literature ever came out as samizdat. And this is true of films from Iran and films from many other countries in which the films are not approved, not licensed, They shared a hatred for the theocratic police state, but some of the older writers also said they felt guilty for what happened to Iran in 1979. Then they said they had disastrously got it wrong. Now they hope to have a chance to get it right. 30 years in the police state had given them, they said, some idea of what freedom means. One man said, maybe now Iran is ready to be modern. In 2008-09, messages from Iran grew more explicitly political. A liberal politician, whose name I won't mention, but who had been in prison for 10 years, called me up, or people around him called me up. Would I please meet him and explain the separation of church and state? I was very glad to. In order to meet him, this was at Columbia at their Center for International Rights. It was on a Saturday when nobody was in the building, and there were like 3 layers of guards before I could get in the same room with him. A woman, and then after that, after this meeting took place, he asked a very smart question. That he said, would I like to come to dinner with him at an Iranian restaurant? And I was very thrilled to do that. And we went, this was all the way over on the east side, near the Rockefeller University. And I guess I came in with him and about 2 or 3 other people. And all the customers in the restaurant were wearing, there were about 30, maybe 40 people eating. They were all adults, and they were all extremely formally dressed. I see one person in a suit that could have fitted into that restaurant. I don't see anybody of either sex, also would have fit in. I mean, there may be more people I'm not seeing, but anyway, as soon as they saw him, they all got up, they dropped their silverware, they all broke into an Iranian song, and all went into tears. And he told them, thank you, but come and sit down. So and then we ate, and people would come over to him and tell him stories in Persian, in Farsi. And he introduced me and said I explained to him the difference between church and state, the separation of church and state. And he said, you see, we will keep fighting. A woman editor called, and she asked, could I tell her readers in about 100 words or so the meaning of the Bill of Rights? The government soon closed her paper. I was thrilled to be doing political theory in such an urgent situation, and proud that Imperial America still had something real to teach the world about being free. Late in 2008, I got a message from Iran that the stream of messages I was getting would probably stop soon. Indeed it did. The state was getting more adept at censoring the internet. And the person who wrote this, the filmmaker, said, it is not that we have forgotten you. It will mean we are in prison. But we will come out. And then in the summer of 2009, there they were, with 1 million people like them out in the streets of Tehran, forming the Green Wave. And this time, unlike 1978-79, there were women in the crowd. A crucial thing to look for in mass photos and newsreels: are there women in the crowd? Are women taking initiative? Are men accepting their presence? Are they helping them be there? Crucial signs of promise. In Egypt, another Islamic capital, in Cairo, women played a big role in the fight for human rights that broke out in 2011. Priests and soldiers worked to push them off stage, but many women wouldn't go. They risked arrest and abuse and shouted, I exist, we exist. It was great to see the protest grow, and easy to underestimate the old ruling class's staying power. Marx, in 1848, in one of the great modern books, the Communist Manifesto, says that people who are just learning to stand up shouldn't expect to win at all. More likely they'll lose. But even when they lose, he says, the real fruit of their struggles is a long-term, ever-expanding union that they can create. And we need to remember this when the old ruling classes managed to take back the streets. Something like this happened in Iran. I grow old, but not too old to feel the rush of life when modern men and women get out and fight to make a place for themselves. Last summer in July 2012, I got this email note. I am an Iranian woman and a PhD student. She says, about all that is solid, I can use and understand all meaning in this book. I just say, this book is my favorite book, and as a student who lives on the other side of the world, I should say thank you. As a writer who's always tried to help people step out and put themselves in the picture, I should say thank you too. In that year of the Green Wave, somebody asked me, wasn't I worried that all that solid was being used for political ends? I said I would be thrilled if anybody out there could find a way to use my work. An editor of an Iranian paper, also later closed, phoned and asked if I had any quick advice. And I said, the streets belong to the people. Stand up for human rights. Stay alive. I'll be happy if I can see anybody see this way or do these things to be here now. In the 1860s, the hero of Dostoevsky's Notes from Underground defined a great modern tradition of fighting, if necessary, maybe even fighting alone, for human rights in the streets. Women saying, I exist, we exist, in theocratic streets, and saying it in the faces of ruling classes that look through them, show us modernism today is as alive as ever, and show us it has plenty to live for. Thank you.
Well, if that's okay with you, can we take then perhaps 5 questions at a time?
Please, as many questions as
Yeah. So, nada, podemos empezar con la sesión de preguntas y respuestas. Si les parece bien, podemos tomar grupos de 5 preguntas, las pasamos y vamos a ver cuántas tenemos, ¿no? Entonces, allá, por favor.
Si podrían decir su nombre, su institución. Yeah, well, I come from UNAM. Here I am. Good evening. I come from UNAM, University from Mexico, National University, and according to what I understood, where you explained, because I have to say that I'm not a well listening, but I understood that you stayed in Latin America, Brazil, Argentina, and these kind of countries. So, and I haven't read your books yet, and so my question is, what do you think we have to leave? I mean, so Latin American society to improve, because we want to be like United States, you know. So according to you, why we have to leave? But in other things, what do you think we have to keep, like social values? I don't know, what do you think?
No lo entendió. No lo
Por acá. sí, esta muchacha.
Ok.
De preferencia sus preguntas en español para que
Que
no
sean
sea
así
más
muy
sencillo.
directas, muy concretas para que sea más sencillo para nosotros contestar.
Buenas tardes, mi nombre es Laís Mendoza, de aquí de la UNAM. Me gustaría preguntarle al doctor Berman, en el capítulo número 2 del libro, usted habla del manifiesto como un arquetipo del modernismo. Ahora que estamos hablando de la sociedad de la información, el espacio virtual, la cibercultura, ¿cuál cree que pudiese ser un arquetipo que divulgue o que contenga el espíritu de nuestro tiempo?
Sí, buenas tardes. Más de 30 años de su polémica con Perry Anderson, ¿cuál sería su lectura de aquella que tuvo en la newsletter, por favor?
Recuerden decir su nombre, por favor.
Su nombre.
Hola, mi nombre es Melissa. Yo no quiero hacer ninguna pregunta, solo quiero saludarlo, decir que de verdad el libro me ha encantado siempre y lo único que quiero es sugerirle que visite, que se dé un paseíto por toda la ciudad, pero no solo por los lugares turísticos, sino por todos los extremos. Yo vivo en Tlalnepantla y Ciudad Satélite, entonces creo que toda la Ciudad de México es una experiencia moderna, entonces eso me gustaría. Bueno, que bien.